Now for our final session of the day, Matthias Niemela is a core developer on the AngularJS project, working primarily on animations, tutorials, and documentation, as well as core-level contributions. He has over 10 years of full-stack web dev experience, and during his spare time, he writes on his tech blog, Year of Moo. Please join me in welcome Matthias.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yeah? All right, so my name is Matthias, and I'm going to talk to you guys about some cool real-time tricks that you can do using AngularJS. About myself, I run and operate the blog yearofmoo.com, and the blog itself has a lot of AngularJS material. I have 8 major articles, and each of my articles go really in depth about AngularJS and what I'm trying to teach. There's stuff on animation, search engine optimization, AngularJS basics, and testing. I have worked for about 10 years on web development stuff, and for the past year I've worked on the AngularJS project. And what we put together so far in a year is we put together ng animates and a few cool doc stuff. And working with the team is wonderful. They're a really bright bunch of people, and AngularJS is amazing. The thought, planning, and architecture that is put into that tool is incredible. So here is the links to the slides for anybody who wants to download these. Just leave this for a few seconds. Okay, so what am I here to tell you guys? I'm going to talk about real-time stuff with AngularJS, real-time stuff overall, and then I explain how you can integrate that into a website and how difficult it is to integrate that, and so on. And then I'm going to explain to you why AngularJS is a good tool to use when building real-time applications. And then I'm going to go over the UI of using animations to make this look really nice and pretty. And then, if there's time, testing and code maintenance. So, out of everybody here, how many people have experience with AngularJS? Wow, that's nice. How many people have an AngularJS application up on the web that I could look at after? Cool. And how many people have built a real-time website or had real-time components in their website before? Okay, great. Wonderful. I was expecting much lower numbers, but it's good that AngularJS is getting up there. So I guess I don't really have to show the basics of AngularJS, or for the people in the audience. Okay, I'll just show a quick demo of how to use Angular. So I have this HTML file here, right? And this HTML file, all it has is a script tag that points to AngularJS. And I don't have anything else in the HTML that makes it special. And the way that AngularJS works is it extends the browser capabilities to make it feel like it's dynamic data inside of an HTML file. And all of the data is handled in the browser, maintained, morphed, displayed, rendered. So if I want to make this application an AngularJS application, I'm going to add this simple attribute to the HTML tag called ngapp. And let's say that we wanted to have a list of numbers from 1 to 5. And let's say that we wanted to have it so that you click on a button and when I click on that button, I'm going to add a new number. And finally, I'm going to initialize the number starting from the beginning. So okay, so let's see how this looks. So I just made this HTML where I didn't specify 3 different elements, 0, 1, and 2. I put these into the Angular format of putting data. Typically, this would be in a controller, but this is a brief introduction to this. And it's repeating these items on screen by morphing the DOM as I put data. See, when I click on the button, it's adding data. Do you see how quick it is to make web applications with this? It is amazing. So we can change styles. We can have it so that if a certain number is displayed, something shows up, something doesn't show up. So let's put an animation on here quickly. I won't be doing too much live coding, so. Okay. So you see how these things fade in? Everything is put so well together with this framework and these new animation features that making really snappy and amazing websites with small amounts of code is possible. Okay, so enough of the basics of AngularJS. So websites, real-time websites, web apps, real-time apps, and so on. I like to group these into 3 separate categories. So we have traditional websites, which are websites that we've all seen, where full page reloads, all the memory is dumped, the page shows up, you click on another page shows up, and then there may be a little bit of AJAX in there sprinkled to make certain pages be more responsive, but I still consider those as traditional websites. Then there are AJAX websites, which are SPA applications, single page apps, and these are Angular websites, Ember websites, and so on, and then fully real-time applications that use WebSockets to communicate with them. But why do you have to have these applications separate from each other? Why can't you mix them together in a nice mixture? And for the terms of this presentation, I'm going to call this a hybrid application. But I believe a hybrid application is an old web term, meaning that you put other websites embedded into your web page. So I don't mean that at all. I mean a mixture between real-time, AJAX, and traditional websites. So why are real-time websites important? As the web gets better and better, better tools are out there, the connections are better, bandwidth is chewed up much faster. Content gets to the screen much faster and seamlessly. And it becomes easier and easier to make websites. So you can have a beginner JavaScript developer make a fully real-time application, a full AJAX application. With what I just made in Angular in 5 minutes, you can have someone build a full application in an hour that would have taken a couple days a few years ago. And you have more control over what changes and what doesn't change when the URL changes. But as a result, the more AJAX that's put on a web page, the more instantaneous the expectation is. So I'm a new user to the internet. My parents just bought me a computer and I can use the internet, and I go to one web page and I have to refresh the page. The other web page is showing content as it happens. And I feel that as the years go on, we're going to soon see the refresh button go away. And this gap between expired data that has expired, you walked away from the screen, you came back, is that data expired? Is it new? No, the real-time stuff is going to update the data as it happens. And finally, we don't need the refresh button after all. Unless you're a developer and you want to check to see if your assets have loaded, then you'll need the refresh button. However, for updating content to the page, we really don't need it. So how does this work? Well, like I said, the key component in a single page application is the URL. When the URL changes, the application finds what changed, loads the template, loads the code, and updates the content on screen. And then it performs a fancy animation to update it, and that's what AngularJS does. It's amazing. So these hybrid applications contain the best of AJAX and real-time code. And my methodology for doing this is to make an AJAX web application, just as you normally would, but then pay attention to the pages on your website that are the most popular or have the most sensitive data, and you want to update that in a real-time fashion. So thinking about that in mind, what's the first problem that comes to mind? And I would say that it's the architecture. You're going to have some sort of real-time service communicate with your page. You're also going to have to keep control over what components on the page need to be updated as the data updates. So let's try to make something with Pusher. And if anyone's not familiar with Pusher, Pusher is a JavaScript library that communicates with a server that allows for real-time streaming between 2 endpoints. So if your server is sending data to Pusher, then Pusher can relay that data back to your browser. And in turn, this is a real-time channel between the server and the browser. This is also possible using WebSockets on your own, but you'll have to develop your own channel on the server, which is pretty difficult to do. So for the purposes of the presentation, I'm going to talk about Pusher. So if you look at our code right here, we have our Pusher connection set up, and we're setting up colors that are displaying on screen. And we're using standard JavaScript. We're not using AngularJS for this, but I wanted to point out how difficult this is to do. As you can see, we have to manipulate the HTML on our own and display it on screen. And let's go to pusher.com and let's actually relay data to this page. Okay, so we have these colors, red, green, blue. And let's say that we want to put some data into this page, right? So the channel I gave this was basic, and the event name is colors. And let's say that we want to add in some extra colors to the page. I send the event, the colors update on screen right away. This is a really handy feature of Pusher that you can update data directly to the page. But it's not that Pusher is complicated, it's that our JavaScript code is highly complicated because we have to figure out how that data gets to the screen, how it gets rendered, how it gets put into the page, and so on. So these are the problems that happen while doing this. So dependency issues for one. Dependency issues are really difficult. How do you know that if the data is coming from an Ajax web application, or how do you know it's coming from your real-time code? How do you maintain that dependency system? How do you deal with disorganized code? Finally, how do you test this? Anybody know how to test this? I would have to somehow copy all of the JavaScript code, put it into a test runner, and then I'll have to mock out Pusher just to get this to work. It would be a pain to get this to work. This is why JavaScript frameworks that deal with this kind of stuff are really good to use. So back to these hybrid web applications. SPA, single-page applications, or even traditional applications from the start, and then you use WebSockets, Pusher, Firebase, or just native WebSockets to enhance the feel of the page. It's kind of like mobile first. With mobile first, you're developing a mobile website from the beginning, but you're enhancing the experience for desktop users as it continues forward. In this case, we're enhancing the experience for possibly connections that support real-time communication back and forth, or for browsers that are better suited to handling that. So what are some examples? GitHub, Asana, Facebook. Let's look at GitHub for a second. So let's go to GitHub. Let's make a new repo. And let's call this FITC in presentation code. This way I can say that I built an app while everybody is watching me. All right, so I have my repo done here. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to paste this to create that application, right? Okay, now we have this empty GitHub repo with just the README. Now let's say I wanted to add actually something valuable in here. Typically when you're developing code, you want to make a new branch, and then you want to merge that branch into master. So let's do that. And let's add in some lorem ipsum text. So we have these websites. And I'm going to use just basic lorem ipsum text for now. So I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to paste this into a file. So file.txt. Or it wasn't demo, I think file.txt. And now if I do git status, we can see that file's there. I'm going to add this file, commit it. I'm just going to call it lorem. Nick's going to hate me because I have a poorly formatted Git message. But I don't have all the time in the world for this presentation. So I'm going to push this to my new branch. And on GitHub, we can see that I have the option to make a pull request. So I make this pull request. And we have one commit in here. But watch what happens right now on GitHub. Let's say that I don't like lorem ipsum. I'm not happy with it. So I want to choose another variation of lorem ipsum. So I can either use the Samuel L. Jackson version, or I can use the Harry Potter version. So if there's any Harry Potter fans in here, you guys will be really happy. So I'm going to copy this, and you get some nice Hogwarts spells. Okay. One paragraph is enough. We're not muggles here. So now I'm going to set the commit message as Harry Potter lorem. So as I push, so it's been pushed. You should see it in a second. It should update. Come on, GitHub. Did I push it to the right branch? I guess it's not updating right now, but when I was doing this on my home connection, it updates immediately without the page being reloaded. Maybe if I give this another second. No. That was pushed. I'm not sure why it's updating, but if I refresh, it should be there. Yeah, okay. Either way, if you try this at home on your own, See, they're still trying to figure this out. It's a new way of building websites, but they're still trying to figure it out. Maybe it was because my Git messages were poorly formatted that they decided not to push it.
I heard universities are horrible for real time.
Yeah. Hopefully that doesn't affect my presentation. So anyways, the purpose of this is that it updates the page. It should update the page as it happens. And that's an example of a hybrid application, because if I go from page to page on GitHub, I go to my account settings, there's a full page reload. And if I change something in my account settings, let's say I change my location to Toronto on, right? It updates. You can see that's an AJAX request going behind the scenes. But then there's a real-time request happening on the pull request page, and there's a traditional web page reload happening from page to page. This is what I mean for a hybrid website. So why does AngularJS fit the picture so well? And the reason is it has this amazing scoping capability where you can basically add stuff to the scope, and whatever is added to the scope, the directives, expressions, bindings will update on the page. Then you can apply animations on top of that to make it really nice and sleek. No one's going to notice real-time stuff updating on a page if there's no animation. Basically, if the animation on the page just changes, the item changes, no one's going to notice that, so you need these animations to make it look really nice and snappy. Finally, you can make AngularJS work with a non-AngularJS application. Let's say you have a basic static website, but you want to add these nice Angular DOM capabilities to it. You can simply include the module and add it. And as 2.0 comes out, it's going to be more decentralized. There's not going to be one library that you have to have. You can have multiple libraries that give you a custom result. So how does this work then? Well, the bindings and the directives, all that stuff, they listen on the scope. So you saw with my AngularJS code that I did in the very beginning, I used stuff like ng-repeat and ng-init. Those are examples of directives. And basically that stuff, the data, which was the numbers that I had, that stuff is listening on the scope. When I update the scope, the data changes, the page updates. Finally, when the page gets rendered, then the animation kicks in. It makes it look very snappy. So let's look at our pusher code. Let's look at the Angular version of this. So one complaint I'm sure people will say right away is, hey, there's actually more code. But the difference is the code is very well structured, first of all, so it's testable, which is nice. Second, everything is very well organized to the point where if I update one piece of my code, I don't have to update the other piece, right? So if we look down in the actual HTML, that's the same repeater that we saw before. But if I want to change things, like for example, I added this tag right here to change the color, depending on the item that's in there, that can happen. So if we actually look at so we have red, green, blue, right? Now if I send this message again, you can see that it updated instantly. So the effect is the same, but the code is so well put together and so organized that putting this together is very easy, and to extend it and to add more to it is incredibly simple. So I'm not going to go through the basics of Angular with what's happening here, but there are very good tutorials out there. I know the docs aren't great with this, but there are good tutorials that will teach you this stuff. So definitely take a look at those. All right, so we have types of real-time connections. So we have native WebSockets, which are supported by most popular browsers. IE 10 and Plus supports them, which is nice. And Socket.io is a code wrapper. And the code wrapper itself contains the functionality to work with other browsers as well that don't support WebSockets. And Pusher.js, what we just used, as well as Firebase. Firebase is a full backend system. And the full backend system means that you can have a database and not care how the database is implemented. You're just putting data on the server, and it's going through the real-time connection. So I put together a demo repo using Angular, using animations, using real-time stuff. And the backend is built with Rails. I'll get to that in a minute. But the tools that I'm using to manage AngularJS, which are the de facto tools that you should be using, Grunt, NPM, and Bower. And we're familiar with NPM and Bower. Nick talked about them. They're the package managers for the web. Karma and Jasmine for unit testing, Protractor, which is the new AngularJS end-to-end tester. So the difference between unit testing and end-to-end testing is unit testing focuses more on code, end-to-end testing focuses more on integration, functionality, how everything fits together. And finally, AngularJS 1.2, where 1.2.4 was released yesterday, and Pusher.js. What about the backend? It's pretty much irrelevant. I could make the backend any language I want. I can make it in COBOL somehow. and then tie that to here, make it with small talk, use Seaside, stuff like that. We can hook that up with the front end, but that's irrelevant with AngularJS, and you shouldn't try to couple the front end with the back end too much, or desirably not at all. So in this case, Rails is the back end, and we're using Rails admin to have a pre-built admin so we can modify data, and when we modify that data, it will show up on screen. So let's explore this application, right? Just launching the programs I need to run so that this website runs. Okay, so basically we have this website that contains, a listing of users and a featured user and, comments. So like social networking 101, basically. And, we have our users list and we have our comments list. Oh, the comments are not loading. That's great. So we click on a user, we have a profile, and, cool stuff, right? So that's our application. There's no real-time stuff. There's no animation. It's a nice app, but it's old school. I have to refresh the page to see the updated content, or I have to click on the link to get the page back, right? So let's make this website real-time. How do we make this website in particular real-time? Well, 2 components, the real-time connection using Pusher, and then the animation code to make it nice and sleek. Okay, so the website's starting up again. Okay, so it doesn't look much different. Somehow this listing of images came to 3 columns, which is nice. That's what I intended for it, but I wasn't expecting the resolution to be so small. All right, so we click on a user page, and boom, we have this fade in, and we go to another page. But this animation stuff isn't super complicated. It's very easy, and other websites have it. Not that big of a deal. But let's see this real-time stuff in action. So I'm going to go to my admin for this page, and let's say that I add a new user. So I'm going to pre-fill. I don't know what that is. Okay, I'm going to pre-fill some stuff on here, and I'm going to add in an image. Put that image, sure, and submit. So now, watch what happens on the page. Do you see that? That's a real-time effect. And the code to do that was so easy and so small, but it's such a cool effect as it happens. So if I delete that user, and there's a purposeful timeout on here so I can fly between the windows. But you see how easy that was to maintain? This is how websites should be in the future. We have another example with a featured user, right? Let's say that we delete the existing featured user, this guy with the forest. It updates, right? So let's actually look at the code that does that. So on our homepage, we have a repeater listing users and the comments and the featured user, right? So we have ng repeat the users, right? That's cool. But we have these special CSS classes, which we're going to use for animations. I'll get to that in a minute, but how do we make this real time? How does the actual real-time data happen? So looking at the slides, this is the code that would make those users update as it changes from the server. Basically, we do an AJAX request in the beginning to get the users, because AJAX requests can, like an AJAX HTTP request can download and have more data in its message. Typically, with a real-time application, you want to have small amounts of messages, because that's where it's most beneficial. So we have these 2 methods called create, or 2 events called create and destroy, meaning that when a user is created or when it's destroyed, add it to the beginning of the users list using this unshift command, and then here, modify the existing array of users and delete the user that I provided, and then return the array. So this modify collection thing is just an abstraction that I created so that I can modify users directly inside of JavaScript code. But dealing with simple data structures such as arrays and just changing the data will signal AngularJS to update the page for you. And the way that it signals it is with this scope.apply method. And everybody who's dealt with AngularJS and dealt with plugins and external stuff for third-party things has to deal with scope.apply. However, that will change with 2.0, but it's still in the process of being changed. So for now, you have to call apply, which will update, will tell AngularJS that, hey, okay, the data has changed. Please render the new data on screen. And that was the repeater code to display the users. That's all it took. It only took a few lines of code. Yes, there's pusher code, hooking it up to the pusher server, and then having the Rails server communicate with pusher, but that's not the complicated stuff. That's common stuff. But for AngularJS to pick up the change and to render it, super easy. So how do we actually do these animations that make it look really nice and easy? Well, we need to include another module called Angular Animate. You saw that with my demo in the beginning, how I included that JavaScript file and then I referenced that module. And this tool supports transitions, keyframe animations, and JavaScript animations. So you can really pick and choose which one you want to use. In the code that you saw in my website, that was using transitions. But we can also use JavaScript and keyframe animations. So this is what the CSS code looks like. Basically, we have a base CSS class, animate listing, you saw that in the HTML. We specify a transition, so 200 milliseconds, animate all the properties that change. And then we have the enter and leave animations. So enter being when an item is put into the page, leave being when it's removed, taken out of the page. Do this animation. So this is the template for that code, but the actual animations code that we have looks like this. We're using, wait, that's not the right one. What was I using? Avatar listing? Or right here. We're using a class called expand horizontally. Animates for half a second, starts at 0 width, animates to 100 width, and so on. And that's how you get that expanding and contracting animation. Very, very simple. So there's this new feature of AngularJS 1.2, which hasn't really been talked too much about, staggering animation. So in addition to animating content, you might notice that the animations, they could be improved a bit. So for example, if I go to my users page and I type in values, you can see that they all disappear. And yeah, there's a little gap in between them, but that's dependent on how fast and how slow I type. Right? It's not really that, like we can make it better, basically. So using that little delay effect that I put into the code, putting it for, half or 50 milliseconds basically. 50 milliseconds in between each item that's removed and added to that listing of items on the page, there's going to be a slight animation. And we also need to put this code in here so that it doesn't get confused with CSS inheritance. But you can see that this effect is really cool and very useful with websites. So I'm happy that that's in the core. Okay, so now that we've talked enough about real-time stuff and how they fall into a website and how you can use them and how they work, let's talk about some of the unit testing involved to make this work. So everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with Jasmine, advanced JS. Everybody knows what Jasmine is. I hope everybody here tests. That could be another seminar. Anyways, so Angular mocks.js is the mocking JavaScript library that you can mock out Angular-specific directives, components, all that stuff. And Karma is a tool that will launch tests on multiple browsers and then tally up the results and tell you which browsers failed, and so on. So given we have these tools, let's take a look for a second to see what the tests actually look like. How do we actually test the pusher code? Because I mentioned at the beginning, you want to take out all the external functionalities such as HTTP requests and real-time stuff, pusher, all that stuff. You don't want to have it communicate with that server because it's prone to failure. What happens if pusher, says, we're not giving any more free accounts? then you'll have to figure out that your tests are failing because of some account issue and so on, right? So to connect to Pusher, this is what the code looks like. Basically, we have the Pusher channel code. So if I look into, you can see here how I have is push user channel modify, or user channel, comment channel, and Pusher channel, right? So the Pusher channel is the channel that actually talks with Pusher, right? So we override that using mocking, and we provide it with fake data that we can insert when we want it to test to see if it actually updates on the page. Finally, down here, we're mocking out the HTTP request so that it doesn't connect to a server that's not there and tries to download stuff. And we're sending Pusher data to it. And once we send this Pusher data to it, we expect it to show up on the page and change. And that's what happens here directly. So to run this test, I type in grunt auto test. It launches Chrome in the background, and it runs a test, and the test is fine. I'm only focusing on one test for now, so I can talk about overriding Pusher. And I also think that the other two tests are failing, so I don't want to show that. So that was unit testing. And unit testing, remember, it's about code. You want to test the code and how well the code works with other code. Integration testing is you want to test the entire application overall. So you're going to have this test server running, and you're going to be sending data back and forth to it. Now, integration testing is more time-consuming, and more skill needs to be put into making this work, and it's a lot more prone to failure. So developing applications and doing integration testing while you're testing, I don't entirely recommend it because you're going to be wasting a lot of time. Like, how many people have tried to do test-driven development and end up wasting all their time getting their test runner to work, and then they give up? That happened to me a bunch of times when I started testing. Now there's good tools that I don't have to waste the time setting up my test runner, but integration testing, you still need to have that time to set it up. Therefore, whenever you publish a new release for your website or application, make an integration test to see if it works. So this tool called Protractor, which is just about to be released, it's useful, like you can use it. Just because it's not released as 1.0 doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It is still highly useful, it's just that the API might change until it's perfect. And I have this built in with the demo repo I'm doing. So if I type in grunt test E2E, that's going to launch Protractor, and it's going to test each page on my website. So give it a second to start up. Oh, it needs to connect somewhere. You can see the website in the background. And it went to each page, and it tested to see one component of the page that's there. So let's take a look at the actual code for that. So the code to run this, we're going to the index page, and then we're going to the users page, and then we're going to the comments page. And we're checking to see if the view container itself contains some text or label that references that page. In this case, the home page contained featured user. The users page had however many users found, and comments found, and so on. That's how it works. But there's a lot of challenges to get this to work. You'll have to have a test database that has fake data. So unless you really want to do this early, do this after you have a working application and you want to test it out. But that's it for my presentation. And the code in that link right there, you can download the full website that I built. And if there's any questions, please let me know. No. Protractor is its own little spawning system, right? It works with Selenium. So it sets up this server where you can connect multiple devices to test it out.
So I've noticed that for real-time apps, a lot of stuff is happening on the screen automatically without the user really have any input to it. Is there any guidelines or best practices? For example, the user working with something, the pusher removes it when it removes all the data.
That's a great question. So the question was, real-time websites are kind of, in some ways, they obscure what's happening on the page. They might change things unexpectedly, or they might change other stuff that you might be currently working with or reading or whatever. So since this is a new area of web development and it's more of what works best, my recommendation is always have a loading indication that some new data is coming in. And the area that's changing, put a shim, put like a cloak essentially on top of it that shows that this area is changing. And if the user is editing a form, have a little prompt that says, there's new data on this page, please update.
Okay, so actually I have two questions. So you absolutely need to use something like Pusher when you're using a backend that doesn't have WebSockets, right? So it's like a Rails application to get the data from the client side. You have to use something like Pusher, right?
Right, so the question was that depending on the backend, if it doesn't have native WebSocket support, you need to use something like Pusher or a third-party system to relay data between the browser and the server. Yes and no. Yes being that it is difficult to set up, like I didn't have too much time to write this app when I first created it, so I probably could have got away with making Redis communicate with the Rails code, and Redis talks to a program that's running on the server all the time, and that could work, but it's kind of hacking it together. And if one of those drops, I'm going to have to go figure out which one has failed, right? So it's prone to failure. Maybe in a few years, you'll end up having web server technologies that support both. So when you turn on the web server, it has an HTTP server that's accepting standard HTTP requests, or it's accepting WebSocket requests.
Yeah, and my other question is related to Protractor. Is there, I come from a Rails background, so is there something like factory girl to create the fake data for to be used for mocking on Protractor?
Right, so the question is there a sort of fixture library that comes with whatever Protractor uses to test? Because that's available with Rails and RSpec. Not entirely, because first of all, Protractor is not really testing code, it's testing a website to see that the data is on there. So you'll actually have to seed the data on your own to that website. For unit testing and fixtures, I do believe there are a couple JavaScript fixture libraries. With the code that I do on a daily basis, I don't really have to make fake data. It's AngularJS core development, right? I don't have to make fake test data. So if you have a look for fixtures, factors in JavaScript, that should do the job for unit testing.
Is that actually speeding up your Rails app though, Protractor? Like it's fully in
Yeah, so if I actually go into my Rails app and I put in browser.debug, I believe, or if I think I just type in debugger probably, no. I can't remember the command for debugging, but that would actually freeze the website. And you would see in another Chrome window the website as it is at that point.
using Selenium?
Selenium, yeah. Yeah.
Have you found that on mobile, animations are very slow?
Yes, actually I have. So the question.
I use a lot of those CSS things that we found on like iOS, which is off. So what do you do in that case?
So the question was that dealing with animations, are they slow with mobile devices? Yes, they are slow. But, like, if I were to make more entropy in my code to go into a specific device and make it optimal for that device, then I'd have to maintain that code. And with Angular, it's just presuming that browsers will catch up and browsers will be advanced. So dealing with animations for mobile devices, typically you would have very simple animations. So you wouldn't fade out the entire page when the page loads, because that's too much for the mobile phone to render. Typically, you'd have one area of a page update, or you just have a loading animation. And the way that you can do this with Angular is you set up another style sheet, or you set up a media query. And that media query will reference what device is using it, at what resolution, and so on. And you can customize the animation for that. Any other questions? Nick?
Like if you're using a lot of transparencies and opacities in your transitions, of course it's always going to be slow. So to avoid it, make sure you use RGB
Right, so the thing is, if you're going to use something as heavy duty as opacity and tweening, alpha filters and so on your web page, of course it's going to be slow, even on a high-end browser. And yes, it's up to your own discretion to make these animations as fast as you can. Like the animation module in AngularJS has been really optimized. I believe through RC2 and RC3, we got it sped up by about 5,000%. So it's really optimal for rendering animations on a web page. But animations in the end will be the ones that slow down the web page. Okay, last question, Nick.
Sorry if I missed the question earlier, but how does Angular with Pusher compare to Meteor for Angular kind of applications?
I was hoping this question wouldn't come up. I'll make sure not to answer Nick's questions anymore. So anyways, so I actually don't know much about Meteor at all. I know the concept behind it, that it would use more WebSocket communications than HTTP AJAX connections. So the point that I was trying to stress with my presentation is that it doesn't really matter what the communication interface is for WebSockets or for Realtime or Firebase or any of that stuff, but it's so easy to integrate into AngularJS. You just have to modify the scope. You have to change the memory of the page. And there may be other tools that are better suited for AngularJS. You know, Firebase has something called Angular Fire, where instead of me having to go in and change the data on the scope by myself each time data comes in, it keeps track of all the nodes on the page that change and it updates instantly. But then again, that could make your code difficult to maintain. So you have to find that balance between something that's easy to use and something that will be more difficult to maintain down the road. Okay, thank you everybody.